Hello and welcome to Grief Tending. This is a podcast series. It's aimed at people who are in a caregiving role, to anyone who is or will be grieving. These conversations seek to cultivate our capacities to be alongside grief in supportive ways. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners on whose unceded lands these interviews are recorded, the Turrbal and Yagara people, to acknowledge their ongoing connection to land, water and culture, and to also pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. Today's conversation is part of the community stream of our series and is relevant for both young people and adults, but especially for those not working in a professional context who may be seeking to be helpful allies to people who are grieving. I'm joined today by Jana DeCristofaro, who is a licensed clinical social worker and also the Community Response Program Coordinator at the Dougy Center in Portland, Oregon. The Dougy Center was founded in the early 1980s and is an organization that provides grief support to children, teens, young people and their families so they can have a safe place to share experiences of grief both before and after a death. The Dougy Center has also for many years offered training locally, nationally and internationally to organizations who are looking to support young people who are grieving. So in her role at the Dougy Center since 2002, Jana has coordinated peer support groups for children, teens, young adults and also adults. And she provides consultation and training for grieving families, students, community members and professionals locally and nationally. And Jana is also the host and producer of Grief Out Loud, the Dougy Center's long-running podcast, which features interviews with other professionals in the grief world and also those with lived experience of grief. Jana has also facilitated community responses for schools and community organizations in the aftermath of deaths. So themes in today's episode include reflections on the Grief Out Loud podcast, and the themes in this episode of Grief Tending include reflections from Jana as the host of Grief Out Loud, which has now, I think, run over 250 episodes. And particularly I was interested to hear from Jana about some topics that she felt were either underrepresented or marginalized aspects of grief that maybe aren't spoken about as much. So hearing from her was I think that was a really important part of our conversation. And then I specifically asked Jana to also share with us some principles for anyone who might be linked to a school. So whether you're a parent or a teacher, staff member, some things that can be helpful to consider about supporting students when grief is present, and particularly bereavement for students. So that will be, I think, valuable listening for many people. Also, we talked about the key ingredients of what might help to contribute to people becoming grief allies, being comfortable in what is usually, for many people, a very uncomfortable space, witnessing grief in other people. And then finally, Jana reflected, on having spent many years working with people in bereavement and experiencing death and dying and suffering, the ways in which she tends to the emotional impact of that work and kind of processes that in ways that are supportive and allow her to keep doing the work. So I really appreciated Jana's insights and reflections. And once again, although the Dougy Center focuses primarily on supporting children and young people, I think the reflections in this episode will be relevant for anyone who is seeking to become more skilled in being a grief ally. So I hope that you find something helpful. Thank you. Jana, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Grief Tending.
Oh, Ellen, thank you for inviting me. I'm really excited to be part of this project.
Great, thank you. So the Dougy Center has been a pioneering organization in a number of ways. And it was the first place in North America, possibly the world, that started to implement peer support based approaches to caring for children and young people experiencing bereavement. And part of the Dougy Center's work has been the Grief Out Loud podcast, which has been running now for 8 years, more than 250 episodes. And I imagine that your experience of hosting that podcast and sitting alongside so many grieving people would have offered many lessons in grief. And if that's true, I wonder, could you share something of how your own experience of grief has expanded or evolved over the years?
People love to ask me that question of how my own experience of grief has expanded or been impacted or shifted in some way based on, the work that I do at Dougy Center, working with kids and teens and young adults, and also through the podcast Grief Out Loud. I never have a good answer to that question because I think it's impossible to know really what's different now, because it's just so much a part of who I am. It's like I clock in for work and I read about people I'm going to interview and I prepare questions and I do the interview and then I edit for hours and hours and hours of listening to the story. But even when I'm not officially clocked into work, everything I'm listening to and watching and reading has some grief theme in it, because grief is everywhere. It's in any good book, movie, TV show. There's going to be some element of grief. So it's hard to pull that apart. I think it has really helped me to recognize the impossibility of the statement that grief is universal and grief is unique for everyone, because both of those things are true at the same time. And honestly, I think it's made me more awkward actually in my personal life of trying to be supportive for friends or family members who are going through grief, because I almost know too much in terms of every guest that I talk to has a different reaction to potentially the same comment or phrase or offer of help. So one person might say, I loved when people reached out regularly and always thought of me on my dad's birthday. And this next day I interview someone who says, I hate it when people text me on my dad's birthday because I know they're just doing it this one day of the year and I wish they would do it every other day except for that day. So I have a lot of voices in my head when it comes to trying to show up for people in my life, which can make it even more complicated. So I would say it's increased the complexity of my understanding of how to support people who are grieving and what they might need. So I don't know, it's almost created more stumbling blocks for me.
Yeah, well, I also could hear you talking to this idea that it requires approaching even what might appear to be, quote unquote, the same situation or similar circumstances, that the humans in those circumstances will mean that how people respond is going to be different.
Fundamentally, yes. And I always go back to, I don't know if it was a guest on Grief Out Loud or someone in one of my groups that said, saying something is almost always better than saying nothing. And so I think if I can't, at least do something, whether it's a text or a call or a reach out in some way, some acknowledgement. And I would say the thing I learned the most is to say, no need to respond. I just was thinking of you. And that's the number one thing I say if I'm reaching out to someone, because the onslaught of supportive texts and phone calls and reach outs that happen particularly early on after someone has died, it's really overwhelming. And then people feel pressure. And so I'm always no need to respond. Just been thinking of you. I'm I think that's neutral enough to not be too upsetting.
Yeah. And I know we'll come on to speaking about that. Yeah, that pressure that grieving people kind of get placed under in terms of feeling the need to respond to all of these often quite vague offers of let me know if I can do anything, these sorts of things. Yeah. So another thing specific to the podcast I wanted to ask, because you've covered so many different topics, there are some, and I appreciate the question I just asked was probably one of them. There are so many more common topics or requests or things that you probably get feedback on. But I was interested to hear, maybe just as themes, are there some of the less discussed or marginalized aspects of grief experience that you've been interested to bring more of a voice to in the podcast, or that you would like to in the future?
That's another great question of like, what are the less talked about aspects of grief or more marginalized aspects of grief that, we need more airtime. And I would say a year and a half ago, I had a very different idea about those different aspects. And in this last year and a half, the one I've been thinking about the most is economics, finances, money. And that is something that most people don't ask about, and most people don't have an opportunity to talk about, and maybe don't feel comfortable talking about. But that finances play a huge role in people's lives after someone dies, whether it's a partner or a spouse who died, and now someone is left suddenly either without income or needing to make more income or needing to outlay a lot more expenses for childcare and all the things that come with having someone die, or people who don't have a lot of economic resources and someone dies and they don't have access to the capacity to take time off from work, or they don't have the privilege of making time and space for grief. And I think a lot of the folks who maybe are writing books or doing shows about grief inherently have maybe more access to those resources. So they're able to write about things like, I took 6 months off and I traveled the world, or, I had this major transformational experience with my grief. And I'm like, what about the people who already are working 2 jobs and cannot take time off? Maybe not even a day off to go to the memorial service because there's no protected leave for people who are grieving, especially if the person who died is outside the kind of quote unquote stereotypical heteronormative sense of whose family, if it's a parent or a spouse. And that you may work for a company who, if it's your partner of 20 years, but you were never legally married, they don't count in the employee handbook for, uh, doesn't rise to the occasion of you get grief leave in that way. So that's an aspect of grief I think that needs a lot more attention. I am happy to see there's more out there now for folks of people who experience oppression and other forms of uh, oppression based on their identity, whether it's their race, their gender, their sexual orientation, their nation of origin, their first language, all of this. There's a bit more out there, but again, I think there's so much more work to be done. And so grateful for colleagues like Dr. Tishelle Bourdaire, who's talking a lot about the suffocated grief that many young, like youth who are Black experience, with their normal expressions of grief being through the lens of racism, penalized in some way, not only ignored, but actively penalized for their expressions of grief. So there's way more to be said about all of those topics. And one other aspect, sorry, and the more I talk, the more I think about things. In this moment in time and where we are in 2023, after what the entire world has experienced through the COVID-19 pandemic, even though people experienced it very differently based on all of those things around access to resources, collective grief and how we as communities recognize loss, I think is very much in the forefront of people's minds. And we don't have a lot of structure or ritual or routine or framework for that, especially with this idea of like, we're back to normal now. And it just sounds so much like the individual experiences of grief that I encounter in Grief Out Loud and in my work at Dougy Center, where people are like, oh, are you back to normal now? And the person who's grieving says, I am fundamentally changed. Every aspect of who I am is different. How could I go back to normal? And I feel like as a collective society, there's this expectation that we're back to normal when each of us as individuals and also as communities and as organizations are fundamentally different. And that degree of dissonance, I think, is causing a lot of confusion for people right now. So I do hope there's going to be more conversations about collective grief.
Absolutely, and those are both such important points, and thank you for highlighting both of them. And I think particularly the collective experience of grief through what the world has been through. I think there's a lot of sense making still to take place in terms of the effects of that, and as you say, this kind of almost mirror echoing of what happens, or what we typically see happen for bereaved people, having this gentle or sometimes quite forceful push to get quote unquote back to a normal that just doesn't exist anymore. So I think speaking to group experience or collective experience, I wanted to ask you about your involvement in responding and supporting school and community groups in your role at the Dougy Center. I know that's something you've been quite involved with. Often schools and community groups, very diverse communities, but they're both often faced with the challenge of responding in real time to deaths across the lifespan of the student population, as well as staff and teachers, in both expected and in sudden circumstances. So I recognize it's a very broad area, and I know that if people are wanting a kind of a 101 or some introductory kind of things, we will link to some existing episodes of Grief Out Loud that speak to tips, particularly for teachers or school communities. But I was wondering if you could share some broader reflections around things that might be, for people listening, might be helpful, or things that are unhelpful as well, for staff or parents to consider in responding to bereavement facing children in a school context.
That's such a big question, Ellen, about like how to, what do schools and teachers and students need when there's been a death in their community? And just like people, it can be unique for each community. And again, I go back to that same maxim of it's better to do something than nothing. And so I think one of the more common things I hear is that, a student has died, a teacher has died, a parent or a community member who's really involved in the school in some way has died, and there's no response from the school. And I think that can be particularly painful for people, because when someone dies, that it impacts the whole community. There's this energy, this draw to be together in some way. And so providing that opportunity for people, I think, can be so helpful. It needs to be in a thoughtful, intentional, planful way. And it'll look different for every school community. But some of the ones where I've seen schools have less contention about what happened is when they took time and space and provided creative opportunities for students and teachers to express their grief together. It doesn't mean coming together and sitting in a circle and everyone goes around and shares their feelings, but I think about the more visible ways that people have done that, whether it's everybody gets a heart-shaped Post-it note and they get to write a message of hope and connection that they hang around on the school lockers, or one school had just put out sidewalk chalk for everybody. And during an open period in the afternoon, they could draw or write messages or just hang out together in the open area. And they created this beautiful representation of their community and had space for reflection on their grief. So, there's lots of ins and outs in all of that, but I do think finding some way to offer people an opportunity to come together and mourn in community is really meaningful for schools. And I know there's a lot of behind the scenes policies and procedures and things that need to be navigated. And our biggest recommendation is always that a school have some type of plan prior to the death, so that you're coming into the situation with at least a little bit of a framework and not having to make it up as you go each and every time, because that is just too much to ask of the administration. There's too many opportunities for people to have disappointments because there wasn't a plan to go forward with in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's such a good point. And, if anyone is listening to this, kind of wondering about what might be a helpful thing, for their school community or their community group, I think that's a really important one as well. If you're not in the midst of that raw or acute grief, if there hasn't been an incident very, very recently, now's a very excellent time to have some of those thoughts and conversations about preparing and planning and what are the things that could be helpful. And so often when we hear or speak to teachers, there's a sense of people feeling not qualified, for want of a better term. I'm not qualified to support this student, or I'm not qualified to do this. And underneath that, I often think, it brings up the example you shared of maybe people are feeling as though they need to suddenly become counselors and hold a talking circle or a grief group or something, rather than these ideas of high visibility, kind of heart-shaped post-it notes feels a lot more approachable, as a way of tending to grief experience. And I often hear beautiful stories of, little kind of grief shrines in the classroom for children to honor a range of different losses, whether that's pets or people in the family who have died. And I think those ways of incorporating death into the life of the school community seem so important, because it's an all of community issue. So it's really helpful, I think, for people to hear that, yes, experts and professionals, specialist professionals have a role, but so does everybody else.
Absolutely. And, I think about that piece that so often what the kids and the teens at Dougy Center have taught me is that when they're in the school environment, they're not looking for their teacher to be their counselor. They're looking for their teacher to be a human who understands them on a human level. And they may already have an existing relationship with that person. They go to school to have a sense of normalcy and consistency and predictability. And so there's ways in which the role of an educator is so valuable, not because they step into the role of a counselor, but they step into the role of an ongoing, consistent relationship for this child, the student who many things have become extremely disrupted in their life at home. And so when talking with teachers or educators to say, what do you know about supporting kids who are going through a stressful time? And use those same skills and understanding, because grief is a stressful time and you don't have to have expertise in grief. You have to have expertise in being a human with your students, which most of them already know how to do, so a lot of what I do is just being like, you're on the right track. Like, you've got the right instincts around this.
Yeah. Thank you for speaking to that, and that leads well, I suppose, into this next question around, how to be an ally in grief. And so I wanted to share a few words from an interview you gave previously that featured in this book, Death: An Oral History by Casey Jarman. So in that book, you were speaking about how, in contrast to spaces like the Dougy Center, which offer a much needed space for grief expression, typically in wider society, grieving people can often be placed in this role of kind of an accidental grief coach or something like this, so that, while grieving and tending to their own experience, they're often also required to attend to the distress or discomfort of friends or colleagues or family who might be very uncomfortable kind of witnessing that grief or being alongside it. So in the interview, you said, for the greater population, anything people can do to present themselves as someone who can be comfortable with the heartache and comfortable with the discomfort and comfortable with the not knowing is hugely helpful for people experiencing grief. Being present for someone who's going through something difficult, even if it's not grief or death, it's a big deal. So the idea of becoming comfortable with heartache, it can sound very simple, but it seems to me this is quite a refined quality, especially in societies that seem obsessed with fixing and finding quick answers. So if we were considering developing this capacity, this allyship with grief, so that we might be more helpful to grieving people in our communities, what would you say are some of the key ingredients that would be necessary, as we seek to nourish ourselves into people who can be comfortable with heartache?
That was such a flashback. I forgot about that interview in that book. It's like a Jana of yore. When I think about showing up and meeting people in grief, heartache, distressing situations, right? This could be a death loss. It could be a non-death loss. A few things come to mind. One is most people who are grieving are bracing for the reality that their experience, and hence them, will scare people away. And so I think about, what can I do to present myself as someone who's not going to get scared off and who isn't going to disappear or who isn't going to run away because I'm now afraid of this person and their experience, because they are already afraid of their experience on their own, right? They are afraid of what's coming. They are in a new land with unfamiliar landmarks. And what can I do to be and remain a familiar landmark for this person, so they don't have to worry about me, because they got enough to worry about? So what does that end up looking like? It looks like, it looks like when you've got like a kitten, who's afraid to come out and get pet, you don't like run at that kitten. You don't raise your voice really loud at that kitten. You match that kitten's energy. And so whether it's a child or a teen or a young adult or your friend or somebody in your book club who is telling you the story, they are going to be metering it out carefully to see. They're going to be watching. How's your tone of voice? How's your facial expressions reacting? What's your body language doing? And you don't want to turn into a robot, right? Just be like, I am unaffected by any sad story you might tell me. But I also don't want to give them the impression that they're making my life harder by telling me their story. It is a true honor and a privilege to be able to hear that story. So even just shifting that mindset, I think, changes my body language and my facial expressions and my tone of voice and the kinds of things that I respond with. So that's not a lot of specifics, but I think really just shifting that mindset. This is a privilege and an honor. I might be the first and only person this friend of mine feels like they can tell their story to. And I want to leave them feeling like I care about them. I'm not going to be scared off by what they say, that they can share as much or as little as they want to. The number one thing people do when they start crying, apologize, right? I'm so sorry. I shouldn't be crying. Oh, I'm a mess, and I say, I'm not afraid of your tears. I got a lot of tissues, no tissues, snot on your sleeve. I do not care. I am not afraid of your tears. You might be afraid of them and that's fine, but I am actually not afraid of your tears, and you're not interfering with my life's joy by crying with me right now. So sometimes being even just that explicit of helping reassure people that their story's not too much. It might be too much for them, but it's not too much for me to hear, is so powerful. And there's lots of things people can do, right, to get more, build up their endurance. Listen to podcasts, watch movies about grief, read books about grief, do something to expose yourself so that you have more of a capacity for that.
Yeah, it's such a good point. Again, when's a good time to start learning or preparing to support someone who's grieving? Well, today.
Yeah, now.
and tomorrow. Yeah, exactly. And as you said earlier, it's something that one of our colleagues here who started at the hospice a couple of years ago and sort of reflected. He was like, I see grief everywhere. Grief is everywhere. And kind of just so interesting to reflect that that's there the whole time. But where our awareness or our noticing is often really is dependent on whether we pick up on that, see that, move quickly away from that, or are able to witness it. And like you say, kind of not turn away, or not, even if we feel activated or might feel fear or strong feelings, it's possible to still be present to that, and that cultivating that capacity gradually, I think, can be a very helpful thing for people to consider.
And also really helpful to not assume what emotion comes with that grief. So I think oftentimes we assume grief is going to come with sadness and despair, which very often it does. But sometimes grief comes with anger and resentment and guilt and shame and joy and relief and the whole variety of the emotional reactions that people can have. So that's a good reminder for me as well, right? Like, I'm not just sitting down for a sad conversation. I might be sitting down for an angry conversation or a relieved conversation or a hilarious conversation, that there can be more than just sadness. And that lifts a bit of the whew, this is going to be a rough one kind of expectation for that conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. So not assuming that you know what's going on, and then similarly, like being with that not knowing for the outcome or the end of that conversation as well. You don't have to know. I think that can take a lot of pressure off people as well.
Yeah.
So I suppose as we're talking about the various different emotions, they're kind of across the spectrum that people bring or experience during grief. I wanted to ask you, because you're someone who sits alongside, grief every day for so many years, you've spoken about how the emotional impact of being alongside grief and death, is significant, but particularly how you found value in kind of processing or taking that, working that through, moving that through your body in more somatic, kind of body-centered ways. And you've spoken about this as sort of metabolizing the emotional side of the work. And that strikes me as quite a different and maybe even more involved response than some of the typical like, hashtag self-care kind of framings that are often around, escape with a bottle of wine and a movie, something like this. I'm not, yeah, does that mean to just set up an opposition or a dichotomy between somatic practices or just having fun? Assuming that anyone listening probably knows the things that they like to do to have fun, not to relax, we can park that piece. I was interested to hear you talk more about this intentionality of attending to, the accumulation of emotions and stories and suffering that you spend so much time very close to. And could you reflect on what it is about movement or engaging the body that you find supportive in metabolizing what you're exposed to in grief work?
Yeah, I mean, I always need to give credit to Laura Vandernoot Lipsky, who's the author of Trauma Stewardship. She is the first person I heard using the concept of metabolizing grief or other emotional experiences. And it just really resonated for me. So really grateful for the work that she's done in that realm. And like what I do for self-care is going to be unique to me. And that not everyone's going to respond in the same way to the same things, but I'm always thinking on three levels, like, what am I going to do for distraction? Because I do think distraction is a very, very valuable part of any sort of way of tending to yourself. If you are in a role of tending to other people and their grief, well, there's nothing wrong with a good distraction. It's just a challenge if that's all you're doing, or if you're not doing it very intentionally. It's more just like, this is I can't be present. I'm going to distract, versus like, whoa, that was intense. I need to shift my mindset for a second. So I'm going to go look at these cute raccoon videos, and then I'm going to come back to it. So I think distraction is a big part of it. The metabolizing piece for me is really about, what am I doing to attend to my physical body? Because it does, for me personally, it takes a physical toll doing this work. Whether it's just from sitting still for 45 minutes and really engaging with someone in an intense story, and maybe I haven't been taking a very deep breath, or I haven't been moving, or I haven't even been aware of my body in 45 minutes. So doing something physical helps ground me back into my own body, stretch things out, make sure I'm breathing. And then just movement's always been a go-to for me in general. It serves many benefits. So there's the actual taking care of my body. There's distraction, because it's hard sometimes to be biking uphill and I can't think about anything else except I really want to get to the top of this hill. So that's good. And also gives me space and time to reflect on the emotions and the thoughts that have come up during this work. So that's why for me, it's kind of like a full benefits package of doing some sort of physical activity. But I know there's lots of different ways that people can work to metabolize what they've been exposed to in this type of work.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a particular interest in the physicality, or the kind of acknowledging the body's role and presence through that process, that I think is really valuable. Often I wonder, because it is grief, because it's linked to things like sadness and tears and things like that, that often the default can be, oh, I need to go and talk out or talk through what other people have been talking to me about, kind of use the same method, as it were. So I think it's I think it's really valuable, to bring attention to this additional part of our experience, with physicality and somatic approaches. So just appreciate that, and we'll certainly link to trauma stewardship as well in the show notes. So Jana, thank you so much for your time today. I just wanted to check whether there was any final thoughts or anything else you wanted to add before we close.
I think I just keep coming back to how much people who are grieving are prepared for bad outcomes when they talk about their grief with people. They're prepared for people to respond with cliches. They're prepared for people to respond with very visible discomfort. They're very prepared for people to respond with advice. And as you mentioned earlier, like the quick fix piece for them, or for people to tell them to feel a certain way or to not feel how they're feeling. And so I go back to, like, what can we do as friends and family members and colleagues and coworkers to stand out and be unique and not add to the suffering of people who are already grieving by putting our expectations on them. yeah, how can we just be different than what they're already ready for? So not giving advice, not jumping in to tell someone not to feel how they feel, not saying you must be this or that must be that. And one of the biggest lessons I ever took away from the teens that I work with is they say, I love coming to Dougy Center and being in group because you all, sometimes you ask me how I feel, but you usually ask me about my person. And that's what I want to do. I want to tell stories about my person. Now, not everybody wants to tell their story to you, because if you're just like the passing coworker on the hallway, that might not be the person. But you have to evaluate, like, what's my relationship with this person who's grieving, and start there. Like, what story have you been thinking about lately? What's a memory of your dad that's been on your mind lately, if it's the right time and place for that? Because those are easier to answer than how are you feeling, or how are you doing, or are you okay? All those questions, there may be a great time and a place for them given the relationship, but those are tricky questions to answer when you're grieving. And much, not for everybody, but for many people, more accessible to tell you a story about their person, or a memory, or something they're missing, or something new that just happened in their life that they're like, gosh, really wish I could have called my mom for that. So that's the only last thing I would think of, is like, there's many ways that we can show up and stand out as unique and be different than what most people are already experiencing when they talk about their grief.
In relation to talking to grief, thank you so much for all that you do in bringing Grief Out Loud into the world, and particularly highlighting, giving voice to people's lived experience, because this is such an important and helpful thing for people. So, in those many long hours of editing many of the episodes, if there's ever moments of difficulty, please know there's a whole community of people down in Australia who are listening and finding value in that work. So thank you once again.
Thank you, Ellen, for this opportunity, and thank you to everyone who's tuned in, and for those of you who do listen to Grief Out Loud and who share their stories with other people. And such a huge honor and a privilege for me to sit with each of the guests who come on Grief Out Loud.